Welcome to the podcast. In our last thrilling episode, we saw the tale of New Netherland, or the other New Netherland. A surprise entry on our season on the other English North. The Dutch returned with little planning, no official orders, and almost no resistance, managed to recover their former colony of New Netherland, which the English at this time split into a New Jersey and New York. Now, even though the resurgence or resurrection of New Netherland was very short-lived, imagine being the proprietary owners of the New Jersey colony. This would be Sir Carteret and Sir Berkeley. They drafted conditions for people to settle there, allowed them to settle for a number of years before having to pay a quit rent, like a property tax. And then when that rent came due, there were rebellions. And then as soon as a medium-sized fleet of Dutchmen came around with a fair amount of Marines, the New Jersey settlers basically handed themselves over to the Dutch, again helping to restore New Netherland. Now, the Lords Berkeley and Carteret, they assumed that New Jersey would be a source of income for them. They'd put out a little money ahead of time, investing in this land that was granted to them by the Duke of York, and eventually the settlers would start cultivating the land, which could be taxed. And there would be other little tiny bits of income along the way, involving tariffs, imports and exports, etc. Instead, the colonists refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the governor, Lord Carteret's own cousin, and instead put Lord Carteret's illegitimate son up on a pedestal as the legitimate governor. Didn't turn out well. Then it's likely that your illegitimate son, who was picked up by that Dutch fleet, told the Dutch about the weaknesses of the New Jersey and New York colonies. I'm being repetitive at this point, but I do this only to underscore that if this was an investment that you were making as Lord Carteret or Lord Berkeley, you have made a failed investment. No money is to be made from these colonies, not by trying to run these colonies, and instead you will only incur more headaches. And so in 1674, while New Jersey is still actually part of New Netherland, Lord Berkeley, who is dead broke at the time, decides to sell his half interest in New Jersey. Now you might be saying to yourself, who would buy this? First of all, the colony had yet to be recovered from the Dutch, and even in English possession is a failed investment any way you look at it. While the people interested in buying New Jersey will not be faraway investors in England looking for a return, they will be a persecuted religious group looking for a refuge. That changes the story a little bit. Much of New Jersey is still fairly empty, and the rebellious nature of the people who already live there, while not perfect, might mesh well with a refugee group who are trying to avoid the status quo in England proper. And in this case, this group of people would be the Quakers, who I've mentioned before. The Quakers are one of the rare groups from the 17th century where much of what they believed in and how they treated others and their sense of morality and ethics might actually fit in with the modern world, or at least the modern United States, among the dominant culture that we have, or several subcultures. They're a group who have many of the beliefs that we often ascribe to the Pilgrims of the mythical Thanksgiving. However, if we were to go to New England in the 1670s, one or two generations removed from those Pilgrims, in 1620, 1621, they are killing Quakers, specifically those who continuously re-enter colonies despite warning. The most famous of which would be Mary Dyer, who was a former follower of Anne Hutchinson, who then later fell into the Quaker fold. And so just like the Puritans before them, the Quakers are going to search for their own little slice of heaven at the very edge of the English world. And who is going to facilitate this move? When Lord Berkeley wants to sell his half interest in New Jersey, Major John Fenwick enters our story. He served in Cromwell's cavalry during the English Civil War, and in 1665, his family converted to Quakerism, joining the Society of Friends, which is what George Fox, who could be called the founder of Quakerism, called his organization. It's John Fenwick in March of 1674, just after the Treaty of Westminster, But before New Jersey could be recovered, who buys from Lord Berkeley his interest in the New Jersey colony for 1,000 pounds sterling, Berkeley only retaining a 40 beaver skin royalty to be paid annually. But already we have a twist in the story. Many question how Fenwick has that kind of money. He's from a family that does well enough. He's likely distantly related to the Fenwick that we learned about with our Saybrook colony. And although Berkeley takes the money without questioning it, the Quaker community eyes Fenwick's close friend, Edward Bylange, a brewer of some means who owed many fellow Quakers a lot of money. And it is the Quaker creditors of Bylange who accuse Fenwick of using money received from Bylange to buy the half interest in Jersey, holding it in Fenwick's name, but really secretly being an investment of Bylange. This 1,000 pounds sterling, if indeed it came from Bylange, could have been used to pay off his creditors. And so Fenwick and Bylange were accused of fraud. As such, Fenwick, Bylange, and his creditors agreed to undergo an arbitration, wherein a prominent member of the Quaker community, who would be seemingly neutral, would hear all the evidence, all the facts, all the arguments, and make a determination as to the ownership of this half share of the New Jersey colony. And if you think this story on Fenwick's colony is not important, that arbiter was a man by the name of William Penn. And this is his introduction to an area of North America for which he will become quite influential. In arbitration, Bylange admits that the 1,000 pounds sterling was in fact his, and that Fenwick was to hold the half interest in New Jersey in trust for him. Now, the accounts vary depending on if you're listening to what John Fenwick said or not. Some accounts say that Fenwick did in fact admit that this scheme was ongoing. Some sources, including himself, say he consistently denied that he was an agent of Bylange. And then some sources are in the middle and say that John Fenwick went back and forth with the truth of the matter. Any way you slice it, after this point, John Fenwick will maintain that he put up the money himself and bought half of New Jersey solely. But William Penn determines that the money was in fact Bylange, who was avoiding paying his creditors, and that 9/10 of the one half of New Jersey should be awarded to the creditors of Bylange. Meanwhile, John Fenwick, as the agent who facilitated the sale in the first place, would be rewarded with 1/10 of Lord Berkeley's original half interest. I know that's a lot of math there, but everything's cut in half. Let's suppose it's a pizza. Cut 10 little slices. The Quakers who Bylange owed money to would get 9 of those slices, and John Fenwick by himself would get 1 slice. In other words, 10% of Lord Berkeley's interests, 5% of all of New Jersey. Already incensed by this, John Fenwick learned that those 9/10 that he still maintains he paid for outright, now in the hands of Bylange's creditors, would be administered by 3 trustees. And one of those trustees, appointed by those creditors, was William Penn himself. Now John Fenwick was calling foul here. Fenwick did not believe that William Penn was truly a neutral party without a vested interest, because suddenly William Penn is working for the same group of people who seemingly won the arbitration against Fenwick and Bylange. And so when the Quakers went to Lord Carteret, who held the other half interest in all of New Jersey, they requested that the colony be actually split into 2 separate New Jerseys, in East New Jersey and West New Jersey. The Quaker group taking the mostly unsettled West New Jersey. Carteret agreed, and pending confirmation from the Crown, we now have 2 New Jerseys, except for John Fenwick, who did not at this point want to throw his lot in with these fellow Quakers, for whom at least publicly he maintained robbed him of 9/10 of his interest in New Jersey. Fenwick says of the creditors of Bylange, "His creditors and others, his factors, hath most covetously and most unchristianly dealt with me, as I have often declared." And Fenwick decides to make his own colony. So we'll have West New Jersey, East New Jersey, and then Fenwick's colony. When the West New Jersey proprietors meet, Fenwick demands that his 10% be awarded to him in one contiguous chunk in what today would be roughly Salem and Cumberland counties, New Jersey, and Fenwick's 10th would be set apart, and he himself would govern it, separate from the government of West New Jersey. Yes, you may have heard of New Jersey being split into two, but you likely never heard of it being split into two, and then one half being split into 9/10 and 1/10. Penn, and the other prominent Quakers involved in West New Jersey, acknowledged that yes, Fenwick was a proprietor, just like themselves. However, he likely had no right to govern any portion of West Jersey separate from the whole. This would lead to a series of lawsuits to settle the matter, lawsuits that Fenwick mostly wanted to avoid. So he quickly began recruiting Quaker colonists for Fenwick's colony, and he intended to settle in the New World before any of the other West Jersey groups would arrive. And in addition to avoiding lawsuits, he was trying to avoid creditors of his own, who eventually caught up with him and would not allow him to leave London until they were satisfied. Fenwick turned to two fellow Quakers, John Eldridge and Edmund Warner, who paid off his debts for Fenwick, but not before the two men extracted a mortgage on Fenwick's colony, yet to be even settled. The mortgage amounted to £110. And in 1675, along with a group of mostly Quaker colonists, Fenwick left London Harbor for the New World, taking his 3 daughters and their families, and yet leaving his wife behind and the rest of his family. He'll never see them again. And with 60 colonists in a boat he chartered called the Griffin, there's a perhaps apocryphal tale that I found in Albion's Seed by David Hackett Fisher, wherein the King of England just happened to also be in London Harbor and cheered them on as they left. Now, John Fenwick had been arrested at least twice for attending Quaker meetings. William Penn had been arrested at least 3 times. I often wonder if the story is indeed true, if the king, who did have Quaker friends, meant to wish them good luck because they were subjects of his, spreading the English Empire, or if he wished them good luck because this distasteful group of a new religion was removing themselves far, far away from him. Perhaps a mixture of both. Perhaps the story never even occurred. They make a good crossing, and they settle on the east side of the Delaware River, creating a settlement that Fenwick names New Salem, which today is just Salem, New Jersey. As English law required, even though back in merry old England you had purchased the right to be a proprietor over this land, believe it or not, it was expected that you would satisfy any natives who had claim to the area. And Fenwick did. He made 3 separate purchases involving 14 different sachems, likely from the Lenni Lenape. Remember, by this point, the Lenni Lenape had suffered from the diseases brought over from the Old World, now for about 2 generations, along with a number of wars with groups like the Iroquois, who tried to subjugate them, and were doing so successfully to some extent. It can be said that Fenwick's colony in the Lenni Lenape never had any conflict. It's quite different than the historical narrative that we hear out of Hollywood, for instance. But not everything in American history is cowboys and Indians. And within these purchases, the Native American groups involved were still allowed to use the land for hunting, fishing, and trapping. It's likely much of it, if you know West Jersey at all, still heavily forested. It's likely that's what the native groups were using that land for anyway before Fenwick showed up, and now would still enjoy those privileges. At his small settlement of New Salem, Fenwick actually held elections for the position of governor. Even though he was the proprietor, the owner, we see here a mixed system of the older system of feudalism, wherein the landowner is the government, and a newer system resembling something of a democracy. But any way you look at it, John Fenwick himself was elected governor. It is then at this point that he takes on the title of, and I quote, Lord and Chief Proprietor of the province of Nova Caesarea, or New Jersey, and governor of Fenwick's colony. Notice within that title, even though he took his 10% in a solid chunk that he separated, he never relinquished his claim to be one of the proprietors of New Jersey as a whole. And in addition to New Salem, soon afterwards he sent out Richard Noble to survey the land and begin a second settlement named Cohanzick, which would also be part of Fenwick's colony. And worth mentioning, there was a pre-existing European population living within the bounds of Fenwick's colony who were not Quaker, nor did they know John Fenwick yet. As Fenwick's colony used to be part of New Sweden and New Netherland, there was a population of Dutch, Swedes, and Finns already living on the east side of the Delaware. And in 1675, just as much of the New Jerseys and the New York governments are being pieced back together after being occupied by the Dutch, John Fenwick, who arrived in West Jersey before the other groups, extended an olive branch to these other ethnic groups within Fenwick's colony, had them report to him the bounds of their properties, and Fenwick confirmed their lands. This is a sticking point for many colonists all throughout English North America that will often endear you to a colonist or give them cause to rebel. As these English governments fall apart or are taken over or are reestablished, the colonists, pretty much more than anything else, want to know that you will protect and acknowledge their property rights. Fenwick did so, and the settlers, which he did not bring over, then acknowledged his authority. It's a Tinkerbell situation. You can be the governor of your own colony if everyone in that colony agrees you're governor. The people inside of his colony won't prove to be much of a problem for Fenwick. However, soon after Fenwick arrived in the New World, the commander at the Fort of Newcastle, who is answerable to Governor Andros of the New York colony, reported to the governor that there was a man sailing to West Jersey to set up his own fief. Now, Governor Edmund Andros of New York barely acknowledged that the New Jersey government legally existed, and in fact, since the Dutch invasion of New Jersey, he viewed that older grant given to Berkeley and Carteret as being null and void, and that the New Jersey colony would by default fold back into his authority and become part of New York again. And so he didn't acknowledge New Jersey as really existing, let alone an East New Jersey and a West New Jersey, let alone inside of a West New Jersey, a Fenwick's colony. And from this point on, John Fenwick is going to be on Governor Andros's radar. At first, moving into the year 1676, Andros sends a summons to Fenwick to appear in New York City. Fenwick ignores this, arguing that Andros is a governor, he is a governor, both men being equal within their own separate environs. He could not be compelled to obey the summons of another. Andros slowly increases the pressure on Fenwick, just as the settlers are setting up shop, clearing fields, moving into the fall of 1676, having their first harvest, starting to get some sense of home. Andros is no longer sending letters, he's sending actual officials to meet with Fenwick. Fenwick, as governor, feeling well within his right to do, refuses to meet with any of these officials, and reportedly goes so far as to run away from them or run into his house and bolt his door shut. Perhaps at this point his colonists began questioning John Fenwick's authority, and in December of 1676, Andros finally sends a small force of men straight to John Fenwick's house, who break in and kidnap John Fenwick at gunpoint, and they take him by force to New York City, where he is imprisoned. Governor Andros charging Fenwick with usurpation of his authority and running his own illegitimate government. Now, at his day in court, Andros argued that Fenwick had no authority to hold his own government. He was a landowner, much as you or I today could be a landowner. But Andros pointed out that, yes, you could own the land, but the king did not give John Fenwick authority to run his own government, an argument he'll also use for the governments of East and West New Jersey. Fenwick, at his trial, served as his own counsel, and he outlined the long trail of men by which he received his right to govern, from the king to the Duke of York to the Lord Berkeley, from whom he purchased from directly, leading right to himself. A two-part argument in that New York City court One, that he was a legitimate governor, and two, that this New York court had no jurisdiction over him whatsoever. Fenwick's colony not being part of the New York colony. Finally, the judge asked for paperwork that would settle this dispute. Show me not only your purchase of the land from Lord Berkeley, but also any paperwork confirming this transfer of governmental authority to yourself, John Fenwick. And even John Fenwick had to admit he didn't have the papers with him in the New World. Andros decides to cut Fenwick a deal that he would let him go on bail if Fenwick would only promise not to govern until his supposed papers could be examined by Andros himself. The stubborn John Fenwick, however, refused this arrangement and continued to question the legality of his imprisonment at all. At an impasse, this meant that John Fenwick would remain a prisoner on Manhattan Island, the trial being in January of 1677. Moving all the way into August, Fenwick still imprisoned, his settlers coming up on their second harvest. A ship by the name of Kent arrives in New York City, full of Quakers, carrying with them the correspondence of the day, and, most importantly, copies of all the paperwork for Andros's inspection concerning the new East New Jersey, West New Jersey, and yes, Fenwick's colony. Andros had to begrudgingly let John Fenwick out of prison on what Andros calls parole, and by October of 1677, Fenwick had joined the Quakers of the Kent and traveled back to his colony, which, despite the lawsuits from the rest of the West Jersey proprietors, the wrath of Governor Andros, and his own mounting debts, he intended to govern. Again, confirming land, he issued grants, he created laws, and with some limited democracy, John Fenwick still had a part in the legislative, executive, and judicial functions of his colonial government. But his debt would be a compounding issue for him. Pun intended on that one, actually. And the timeline gets a little fuzzy here, but Fenwick's creditors, Eldridge and Warner, were becoming impatient with his lack of payments on his mortgage, the collateral being his entire colony. And then Andros again, at least once, but perhaps twice, within the tail end of 1677 all the way into 1679, arrests Fenwick. And at least one of those times, it was for lack of payment to his two creditors. However, another charge he faced was harassment of the Dutch, Swede, and Finnish settlers of Newcastle. However, at the end of the day, the New York court only confirmed Fenwick's right to confirm deeds and extract a yearly quit rent from the settlers in question. He actually won. And starting in at least 1679, even the non-Quaker population of his colony were in fact paying him quit rents, which we would call property tax. All in all, Andros had Fenwick imprisoned in total over 2 years of his short life in the New World. And the histories claim that John Fenwick was never the same after these extended periods of confinement, that he stopped attending meetings and became very withdrawn as a person. Fenwick himself writes, "My door broken down, my person seized on in the nighttime by armed men sent to execute orders from the governor of New York, to whom I was sent prisoner in the depth of winter by sea, his order being to bring me in dead or alive." Fenwick began borrowing money from none other than William Penn in order to satisfy Eldridge and Warner. A modern-day equivalent would be paying a credit card with a credit card. Not the best idea. Still not satisfied, Eldridge himself traveled to Fenwick's colony to demand payment. When the two men came face to face, Fenwick attacked the man physically. Eldridge ran off. Fenwick sent a posse after him, eventually tracking Eldridge to the fort at Newcastle. Again, very much under Governor Andros's control, the commander of the fort would not surrender Eldridge over to a mob, and instead, for his own good, they put him on a boat and shipped him back to England. Well, Eldridge proved to be far more threatening back in England than he was in New Jersey, and in August of 1680, the Duke of York reissues a deed declaring that Fenwick's colony was now owned by Eldridge and Warner. Honoring the lien on the mortgage, Fenwick's colony was no longer Fenwick's. Never able to raise enough money to satisfy his creditors, Fenwick had sold away much of his undeveloped land within his own colony to William Penn, much of the literal land being owned by Penn, and then the right to govern as derived by being a official West Jersey proprietor now being stripped of him. John Fenwick's days as governor were at an end. Eldridge and Warner had no interest in being colonial governors, and so they were looking to sell Fenwick's colony, and guess who they sold it to? You're 100% right. They sold it to William Penn and the rest of the West Jersey trustees. William Penn, as arbiter, strips Fenwick of 90% of his claim to West Jersey, then is immediately hired as trustee to that 90%. Fenwick, now having a much reduced amount of territory to sell rights to, takes on debt to found his own small colony. Unable to make those payments, he turns to William Penn to loan him the money, or raise the money by selling his own undeveloped land to William Penn. And then when the Duke of York hands Fenwick's colony over to his creditors, William Penn swoops in and buys Fenwick's 10th. This would be John Fenwick's spin on this tale. It certainly makes William Penn one of the few men from the colonial era who could truly stand up to modern morality look like the villain, doesn't it? However, perhaps it's more likely that John Fenwick was aiding Bylinge in a fraudulent sale to himself to avoid Bylinge's own creditors, only to overspend and under-earn, and with admittedly a heavy dose of harassment from Governor Andros, found himself in a massive amount of debt. And perhaps William Penn is just a steward among the Quaker people in the New World, who wanted to make sure that the Quaker population of Fenwick's colony remained under the government of Quaker proprietors. The fun thing about history is that you get to choose your own heroes and villains. The dust really doesn't settle until 1682, when John Fenwick finally acknowledges that his colony is being absorbed by West Jersey. And it is in that year that the West Jersey government folds Fenwick's colony in with the settlement of Burlington, which we'll learn about in a future episode, to make a new county of sorts that would have its own deputy governor and local assembly. But John Fenwick keeps 150,000 acres for himself, a nice chunk of land he didn't manage to sell away. He stubbornly calls this his manor, and he still styles himself a lord of that manor. And then quickly, without the responsibility of governing his own colony, and his debts finally being resolved, and the governor of New York now the problem of the West Jersey governor and not himself, Fenwick found a little peace. He had grown quite distant from the larger Quaker community, as you can imagine, and he found himself reconciling with many, including William Penn. By 1683, Fenwick had become a member of the West New Jersey Assembly, and reportedly by the end of the year, he had died. Many of his former Quaker enemies mentioned positively in his will, and his estate was estimated to be valued at 20 pounds. And now you might be saying to me, Eric, why was this story important at all? Why did you make me listen to all of this? Also, Eric, how do you hear me right now? I'm not in your house. Well, I'll answer the first question. First of all, more than anyone, it was John Fenwick who wrestled away the Lord Berkeley's interests in New Jersey. Again, not a great investment if you're looking to make money, but as a safe haven and a fresh start for English Quakers, who, having no interest in being part of the Carteret government, had New Jersey split into two. And so East and West New Jersey are very much part of the legacy of Fenwick's colony. But moreover, the historian David Hackett Fisher identifies the 1675 migration to what is now Salem, New Jersey, as led by John Fenwick, as the beginning of the Quaker exodus in earnest. And we don't think about the Quakers very much anymore, but there were times in colonial history when the Quakers controlled 4 or 5 of the colonial legislatures, especially towards the second half of the 17th century. And even later, leading right up to the American Revolution, Quakerism as a religion would be a top 10 or top 5 denomination in terms of numbers within British colonial America. The most prominent Quaker, of course, in colonial American history being William Penn. If you go up the chain of causality, you end up back at John Fenwick. And if I haven't laid it on too thick yet, William Penn is, of course, the founder of Pennsylvania. But taking it out one more layer, beyond Quakerism, and its impact on American thought, especially concerning personal liberties and ideas about the morality of slavery, David Hackett Fisher and Albion Seed argues that at the base of American culture are 4 distinct migrations from England, but also the British Isles as a whole, that went to 4 different areas of colonial America. One of the 4 migrations is the Quaker migration. And what they brought to the New World was not just Quakerism, but also the English culture of the areas of England from which they came from, which in this case, the dominant region would be the North Midlands of England. And to this day, the Quaker exodus has left its legacy in the DNA of sorts of the regional accents found in New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. But I don't want to ruin too much of the story for you, because now that Fenwick's colony is no more, obviously, you have to tune in next time for our next episode, or series of episodes, on East and West New Jersey. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. I don't know why I say us all the time, it's just me. Find us on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter. I'm Eric Yanis. This has been the Other States of America History Podcast. Thank you for listening.